Excellent. Thanks so much for that introduction, Ryan, and really appreciate the opportunity to be here today to share some information. I'm going to stress before I get into the presentation that this is 10 minutes consolidated from something that could probably be a 3-hour lecture, which nobody probably wants to hear about for that long. So it's going to be a lot of information, very short snippets of information, and I'm sure much more that you want to know, which is always exciting. So I'll note right now, I'm always happy to chat at some point if anyone wants to reach out to get more information. The study is ongoing, so it hasn't quite wrapped yet, but there's a lot of data here and a lot of work that's still going to happen this year. So this is sort of just a little bit of a snapshot into things that we've done so far. And so a really quick acknowledgement of the research team being myself, Dr. Ryan Gibson, Dr. Chris Fullerton, and a recent graduate of the Rural Planning and Development Program, Natasha Gaudio-Harrison, who did the majority of the data analysis and actually put this presentation together for me. So super excited that she was able to assist with that, even though she isn't here to present today. So the project itself came about for a number of reasons, but I think most importantly, we heard during the pandemic a lot of anecdotal information through print media, through online media, through so many different sources about this seeming exodus of urban residents to more rural places. And really from the start of the pandemic, we'll say March 2020, there was this sense of escaping the ills of urban life and going to more rural places between 2020 and 2022. And we heard things like rural places offered more space, whether that was just getting out into nature, whether that was properties. There was a perception that rural places were much more affordable places to be. And then, of course, this idea of escaping the ills, so-called ills of the city. But there was really no certain facts of this migration. A lot of it really was sort of anecdotal things we were hearing, and then what the impacts were post-pandemic. And so through the Ontario Agri-Food Innovation Alliance, which is a partnership between OMAFA and the University of Guelph, this sort of research question was posed. We applied for it. We got funding, which was fantastic. And the initial results are what I'm going to share today. So we did have 4 fairly broad objectives. Number one, and I think this is probably for all of our projects as they impact rural communities, was to support rural communities and rural stakeholders within Ontario. The second was to gauge the current situation regarding COVID-induced urban to rural migration. And we've highlighted central, eastern, southwestern, and northern. So the goal was really to cover the entire province, recognizing that experiences varied depending on where you were within Ontario. Third was to better understand the impacts of increased urban to rural migration. And then fourth was to identify a number of best practices for a variety of different stakeholders. We do know, as a little bit of background, and I won't spend much time on this because I think the survey results are probably the more juicy pieces, is that there has been a growth in rural communities. And so the quote here is that the latest census showed more rural CSDs experienced positive population growth in the 5 years leading to 2021 than any time since 1996. Almost doubling, which I think is incredible to think of. And that's sort of before some of this really COVID-induced migration I think we were seeing happen. So we already know there's this resurgence in many rural places, and really an understanding, I think, that the pandemic really exaggerated, exasperated, frustrated, a whole host of different terms we can use, but fueled, I think, some of that migration quite significantly. And so as one component of this project was a survey that we shared, and it went out to senior municipal professionals across the province, so CAOs, planners, economic development professionals, clerks, as well as elected officials. It was multiple choice and open-ended, and it really focused on this perception versus reality component. So we asked some questions that were about perceptions of change, and then also questions that sort of required respondents to fact check a little bit and make sure that some of those changes were in fact happening. Although we can learn a lot from perceptions, sometimes it's helpful to know that there is data demonstrating that some of these things have actually happened. And so we had 87 complete responses that did come from across the province, which was fantastic. And that data will then inform our case studies we'll be doing later this year. So one of the first things we asked municipal professionals about was their perception on population growth, to understand if there was a perception versus reality piece in the migration trends we were seeing. 59% of respondents did note that the population change they perceived was validated by the census. So a majority of respondents did perceive that population growth was happening, and the census did validate it. So that was really helpful to see. It wasn't strictly a perception-based response. We also asked respondents about some of the trends they were witnessing to understand sort of a general profile of the types of people migrating to rural communities. Urbanites seeking a rural lifestyle was absolutely the most common trend they witnessed. Maybe not surprising. I think that was one of our assumptions going into this. And it was a descriptor that we could also see applied to other groups, such as retirees, remote workers, and cottagers that were moving to rural places full time. So they all sort of fit under that umbrella, but it really was a profile that wasn't surprising and was absolutely validated by respondents. We also asked respondents about push and pull factors that they are witnessing among people migrating to and from their communities. The most interesting outcome was the pull factors because it highlighted that access to green space seemed to be the most important factor to incoming residents. So those that were moving from urban places to a rural community, that access to green space was one of the largest, if not the largest by a significant margin there, pull for rural communities. Affordability, availability of housing, those were also top reasons. And again, this gets into some of those perceptions and assumptions we had early on. And this is relative, though, to housing found in the city. So housing in a city, selling a house for $2 million, moving to a rural community, spending $800,000 on a house may sound affordable to that person who's now moved, but that affordability of the existing house in the rural community, I think, is something that we should still sort of tease away at and get a better understanding of. And these factors really do continue to be a challenge for locals. They take away from housing stock, they impact rural communities, they impact affordability, of course. And so the push and pull pieces have to be something that we really do consider. We also asked about some impacts to the community itself in response, and we were interested to know whether respondents had witnessed any conflicts between new and existing residents. And this really came from the media that was coming out between 2020 and 2022 about conflict. And maybe not unsurprising, 65% responded that they had witnessed conflicts happening in the community. And so some of these quotes, NIMBYism was a big one. Tourists versus residents was something that a respondent had provided. There was a lot of different opinions on best approaches to tackling social issues such as homelessness, and that was brought in with more urban perceptions or opinions. And then complaints about traffic and losing the small town feel. And this one is always really interesting to me because that small town feel is a pull for residents moving there, but you lose that small town feel as we attract more and more population. And so those complaints were absolutely happening in some of these rural places. Respondents were asked about social and economic impacts as well, which I'll be going through quite quickly, as well as impacts on housing, because we know it's an incredibly hot topic right now and will be for quite some time. And here were the three that rose to the top. So we saw an increase in the use of outdoor public space. So we see the green space, outdoor space coming up again as quite high. Decrease in mental health of community members. And I think that's something we could probably say pandemic-wide was an issue, regardless of where you were. And decrease in food security, which were all very much concerning social impacts. Some interesting quotes here, and I won't read all of them, but the second one I think is really interesting. Youth have been most profoundly impacted. There is a real sense of hopelessness amongst 15 to 21-year-olds. Volunteers have not returned in their pre-COVID numbers. Use of the food bank and hidden hunger has absolutely skyrocketed. We see more people living in tents or cars with virtually zero supports in our small rural community. And attached to that, the next one, which was a separate quote, was our older generation of community volunteers has aged out and not been replaced by a new generation. So while a younger generation may be moving into these rural communities from urban places, the level of volunteerism that was seen before the pandemic has not been maintained with new residents. It's absolutely gone away, decreased with the sort of retirement, if I can use that word, of volunteers. Housing impacts, probably not a surprise here. And again, I think this is something we see really across the country, but increase in cost of real estate and rental accommodation, increase in unhoused population, and then an increase in new housing construction, as well as the cost of building materials. So it was fantastic to see more houses being built, but the cost of those houses has been going up significantly as well. And so we see those who have never been or underhoused are facing homelessness due to the cost of utilities, lack of pensions and wages keeping pace, lack of attainable housing, loss of a spouse, influx of newcomers with city expectations. Homelessness was next to non-existent. However, it is now available or is now visible. And lastly, we were already gentrifying. The pandemic accelerated what was on the horizon. And I think that one is really, really telling that this process was already happening in this community and the pandemic really just sped it up. Some economic impacts related to support for local business, as well as new business startups, and a few quick quotes there. Rapidly increasing population demanding city-type services in a rural setting and no additional human resources to satisfy these demands. And online shopping during COVID restrictions changed retail patterns, making it more difficult for local businesses to remain afloat. This was already occurring pre-COVID and is not necessarily significantly correlated to the pandemic itself, but I think we did see a lot of business closures during the pandemic and many empty storefronts as a result. There are opportunities. I'm going to go to challenges after this, but there is some positive stuff. So we see an increase in community diversity, which is nice. New housing construction is happening, and there have been new businesses and new business expansions as a result of hybrid work and increased telecommunications, which I think is a win for rural communities. Some challenges, though, are related to rental accommodation. Costs have increased and availability has absolutely decreased. Housing availability in general has become more limited, and then access to healthcare as well has become more limited. Again, not easy enough to say that that's directly related to the pandemic, but it absolutely has been exacerbated by the pandemic. And so the next steps for this project is to finalize the survey results, get our case studies completed across Ontario, again, looking to have representation from all of the different parts of the province because experiences were very different. Get into our findings, recommendations, and then our final report, which we will share broadly. This is all happening in 2025, so it's a really exciting time frame, I think, for this project, and we'll wrap at the end of the year. So exciting to sort of tease some of these findings right now. And with that, I'll say thank you, and I'll turn it back to Ryan with all of that information to go into the panel.
Thank you so much, Sarah, for